it to complement monetary policy. A tool that is widely used among emerging economy, and in the paper we have some figures from the BIS, but I don't have time to show that the foreign exchange rate intervention is still very important in this group of countries that they have this kind of partial inflation targeting regime, not the full-fledged, but they have some partial, and the foreign exchange rate intervention is important in the emerging economy. That is not so important in the typical advanced economy. They have inflation targeting regime. So in this work, we try to analyze the role of foreign exchange rate intervention in dealing with the capital flow shocks, and mainly if this effective policy tool to deal with capital flows driven by global factor, and if the use of foreign exchange rate intervention is a welfare improving policy when it's used in response to the global capital flows. And especially this is important when you have partial dollarization in the economy, in terms of part of the liability of the corporate sector are denominated or indexed to the foreign currency, namely the dollar. That create additional room for using this, and we try to address this question. What we do two types of things in this work related with this policy question. First, we estimate a vector acceleration model in a sample of small open economies, and we analyze empirically the interaction between capital flow shocks, foreign exchange rate intervention, and liability dollarization. We then develop a small open economy model with very standard, and the typical things that we include is financial frictions that create a channel of balance sheet effects linked to the liability dollarization, and also in the transmission of capital flow shocks. Also, the additional element of the typical standard model of this feature is that we also include imperfect asset substitution between domestic and foreign bonds, which allows foreign exchange rate intervention to have real effects in the economy. And then we use this model, this structural model, to understand the transmission and to try to analyze the role of the liability dollarization and the financial exchange rate intervention. Okay, so that is what we do in the work. So I don't have much time probably to go in detail to the review literature, but the work related with the list of work related with us is quite long, but I try to make some point. I'm going to present some key result of the vector acceleration models estimation. Then I'm going to jump to the BSG model to explain very briefly the calibration, some elements, and then some simulation with the model, some welfare analysis, and then I'm going to conclude. That is the plan in the minutes that I have left. I think that there is a list, very long list of regarding the theoretical use of the channel of how the foreign exchange rate intervention operate. The typical recent work are related with imperfect asset substitution that creates some kind of portfolio channel effects of foreign exchange rate intervention, and the list of paper are there. And also there is some empirical work, and that Olivier Blanchard and Gustavo have a paper on that, try to identify some way, because typically it's hard to identify in the data the effect of exogenous foreign exchange rate intervention. So it's a empirical concern how you do it, but you can come up with some idea. We follow closely with the vector acceleration some idea on in that work that Gustavo has with Blanchard, and other paper as well. There is several theoretical paper regarding that connect financial dollarization, liability dollarization, and probably we will say that the first one are the work of Cespedes, Chani Velasco, and Gerle, Gilic, Nantalucci also have this concern. And the list is very long in that respect. Probably the dimension that is now appearing recently is to connect this problem of financial dollarization, financial friction, with the use of foreign exchange rate intervention. And we are trying to also fill in some contribution in that respect as well. So what we do with the Bechdel acceleration model, so we have a sample of 45 advanced and emerging economies that are not reserve currency countries. That is important. We have quarterly data from the first quarter 2000 to the last quarter of 2018. And then we create, as the work of Gustavo, this global capital flow variable. That is the flow in the rest of the country. So it's not the flow in my country, it's the flow in the rest of the country. And then we treat that variable as a very exogenous variable. So it's a exogenous flow, global flow in the rest of the world with respect to the country. And then we have a set of macroeconomic variables appended to this autoregressive process exogenous of capital flows and try to compute the effects. And try to, first, we separate the sample regarding using the indicator of dollarized and non-dollarized economy of Eduardo Levy-Yeyati to try to separate countries that are classified as dollarized and non-dollarized. And then we take that if the average deposit dollarization is 20% or more, we classify this economy as dollarized. And below that threshold is a non-dollarized economy. So that is a So, and fortunately, the sample in that way, we have 23% of dollar, so 23 countries in the dollarized classification and 22 countries in the non-dollarized classification. And then we compute the response as the median response. Here I'm going to present without the confidence interval. We have the as appendix, we have the confidence intervals, but sometimes the way that some part of the band intersect is no good to see it, but that is what we do. So here we have a positive, so it's a increase, exogenous increase in the global capital flows, and then we see an increase in GDP in both type of countries, dollarized and non-dollarized. We see increase in inflation, some increase in interest rate, some reduction in this index of real exchange rate. So it's a appreciation, and sometimes an increase on the foreign exchange rate for foreign reserve as a percentage of GDP of each country. And what is important, especially in terms of GDP, that is a significant difference, that you see that in dollarized economy, the effects is bigger, okay? And that is typically what you expect if you have some kind of amplification mechanism that you can have with balance sheet effect linked to the exchange rate, that you have appreciation, since you have limited dollarization, you have increase in your balance sheet that creates some additional possibility to rise more debt in the corporate sector and so on. So, and then you see that amplification occur, and it's important. Also, we then try to dig a little deeper in the mechanism inside of the dollarized country. So we take the 23 countries that are dollarized, and then we try to separate the country with the following idea. We classify regarding the reaction of the interest rate, and the country that have the reaction they have more reaction in the interest rate. Okay, so that is the black line here, are classified one type, and then we have the country that have a more stable reaction of the interest rate. Okay, and then we separate the country regarding again some ranking, and then we take the first group of country, and in each line we replicate the median response in that set of country, the stable reaction of interest rate and the more reaction. And then what we see that the more stable reaction is also associated with country that intervene more in the foreign intervention, they accumulate more foreign reserves, and also they are able to attenuate a little bit more the expansion of GDP. Okay, and then you see that the appreciation is more muted in this kind of country when they deploy this. So again, this is one way of trying to identify. So there is many things, but they pointed out to some role of the foreign exchange rate intervention in the way that you can attenuate the business cycle, and then you can use your monetary policy rate in a more stable way, try to attenuate the appreciation and the boom of the country. Okay, so I don't know how much minutes I have. So then I have the model. The model is fairly standard in many dimensions. The typical, so is a small open economy with goods that are domestic or imported. You have the financial accelerator like the BGG model, and you have liberty dollarization, like Giedrich Natalucci. You have policy instruments, you have the monetary policy rate and the foreign interest rate, and then we have a base regime that is a standard tailored type rule and without foreign exchange rate intervention. That is the typical, the base one. And then, so the typical critical ingredient that we have, the corporate sector can have debt and the leverage is linked to the exchange rate. So we take a simple example here that we take that a fraction of the leverage is in foreign currency, other fraction in domestic currency, and then when and that fraction is fixed for the time being in this specification, and then we have a channel where the exchange rate affects the movement, affect the leverage of this, and that affect the credit spread that this corporate sector affects. So when the leverage increase, the spread rise, and when there is a depreciation of the currency, the leverage increase for that balance sheet effects of the asset pricing, and that increase the credit spread for this corporate sector. And also we have this imperfect asset substitution that create a wedge in the uncovering disparity condition that we can name like a portfolio balance effects of the intervention. So when there is a intervention with foreign exchange rate accumulation, they create additional effects that make the currency to depreciate through a wedge in the. So that is the typical. So we calibrate the model with very standard things. So I don't know how much time I have to go, but there are typical. The important thing is the last point, that we have a reduced form model, but we take this work of Bayumi et al. To try to compute what are the effects that are estimated of one increase in on the foreign 1% increase in the foreign exchange rate as a percentage of GDP of the country. What does the effect in the current account is around 0.3, 0.4, and when we calibrate these, other things are very standard. If you take from the data of liberty dollarization is from the country that I mentioned, that we classify a dollarized economy are. The fraction of deposit dollarization is 49%, so we use just 50%. So that, but in general, the calibration is fairly standard in those dimensions, and and the typical calibration that of the monetary in the standard monetary policy rate, you have this some smoothing of monetary policy rate, some reaction of inflation, some reaction of output. That is really standard. So that is the base without any foreign exchange rate intervention. So
Juan Pablo, since you were asking, you have 10 more minutes.
Okay. Okay. 10. Okay. I was running. I thought I was having less time, but
no, you have 10 more.
Okay, 10 more. So I'm gonna try to now. I slow down a little bit just to. So what we do with the simulation of the model, we create this kind of capital flow shocks with increase in the risk-free foreign interest rate. So that affect all the country the same. So there is no risk premium for the country. So to reproduce capital inflow shocks, we are going to have a reduction on the foreign interest rate, okay, of 1%, okay. And the first thing that we're going to try to do is we are going to made two scenarios. One without liability dollarization, so the country doesn't suffer any liability dollarization, so all the leverage on the corporate sector is in domestic currency. Another situation when there is liability dollarization and we have the 50% of the debt is denominated in foreign currency, and the other 50% is domestic currency. And we assume the baseline regime that we have this pure floating regime with the standard Taylor type rule, and the foreign reserve are constant. And then we reproduce more or less the idea of the amplification where we saw in the vector alteration estimation, when you see that when you have dollarization, you have a bigger effect of capital outflow, and the important thing is the effects of the credit spread that here. Okay, so you have a real exchange rate appreciation, a nominal exchange rate appreciation that improve the leverage of the corporate sector, and that create more room to raise debt, and that create a bigger boom for the demand side of the economy, and the reflection of that is a fall in spread, a higher expansion in GDP, a higher expansion in employment, and so on. So the inflation reduced because dominate the appreciation of the currency in inflation, although there is a bigger boom, but dominate the effects on inflation, and the monetary policy have to reduce the rate. So that is the amplification that we saw, and now we have the structural model to confirm that result. One thing that is important is what happened with the dollarization. And let me try to explain this graph a little bit. That is, the first line corresponds to the spread reaction, and we have in one column is the reaction when you have a rise in the first column, rise in the interest rate, and the second column is when you have a rise in the foreign exchange rate reserve. Okay, and what is important is when you don't have dollarization, you can affect the spread typically because you contain the aggregate demand, and that has an effect on asset pricing and demand, and that increase the leverage of the corporate sector, and that increase the credit spread. But when you have dollarization, you have an additional channel. When the interest rate increase, you have an appreciation, and that attenuate that channel of control of affecting the credit spread in that direction. And so that is the effectiveness of the movement of interest rate in affecting the credit spread is reduced. In the other side of the coin, you see that when you don't have dollarization, the spread is really muted to the changes in foreign reserve. So the blue line here. But when you have dollarization, you have this balance sheet effect that affect the credit spread. And then when you rise the reserve, you depreciate the currency, and that increase the leverage because you have the domination in dollar and foreign currency, and that increase the leverage of the corporate sector, and that increase the spread. So with dollarization, the relative strength of the foreign exchange reserve is bigger, and the relative strength to controlling credit spread is lower with dollarization for the monetary policy rate. Okay, so and that is important to keep in mind. So for that reason, it's natural to ask what is the optimal combination of reaction of interest rate and foreign exchange rate reserve when you have dollarization, and that way we do next. Okay, so we try to do the following. So one way to try to come up with the optimal response is try to follow the foreign interest rate with the monetary policy rule. So we try to compute what is the optimal response following the foreign interest rate with monetary policy, or also adjusting the foreign exchange reserve, reacting to the foreign interest rate. Okay, so and then we try.
Juan Pablo, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So first, so we have the baseline without any optimization. Then we have an optimal case where we only make the optimal case for this coefficient. Okay, we assume that this coefficient and these other coefficient are 0. Okay, so in this part is constant. So we have a second optimization case when we optimize these two coefficients. So that is this is the 1 case, this is the 2, but we keep this other coefficient in 0. So, and then we try to join the termination. So they are the three regions. So we focus in the optimal reaction of monetary policy rate, the optimal reaction of the foreign rate intervention, or both. Okay, so that are the three regimes that, and we use a welfare criteria with equitable approximation to compute welfare to choose this optimal reaction. So that is what we do next. And the results, and you can see that the optimization related to the baseline of the monetary policy rate is not, it creates some reduction in volatility and attenuate, but it's not to have too much differential with the red line and the blue line. And then you see that the optimized FAI's rule, the second case, have a much control of stabilization of the economy and have this gradual increase in foreign exchange reserve. And also, if you do it with the joint optimization, you can see that you still gain, but the gains are more marginal. So the really important game is to use foreign exchange intervention optimally. And then when you do that, the additional use of monetary policy interest rate optimally is less. Okay, and then you can see it in this in the welfare loss that imply the baseline. You see that if you optimize the reaction of monetary policy rate, you can gain in terms of reducing the welfare loss, but it's small. The big gain is in this segment. Okay, so here. Okay, and then you see that you can still reduce, but the big is deploy the foreign exchange rate intervention optimally. That is the big gain. Okay, and with that, I can conclude. So we have bar estimation, vector duration estimation, that show that the positive shock to capital global capital flows have an expansionary effect on output, and this is exacerbated in economies having elevated dollarization. Empirical estimation also find that FXI intervention can isolate the emerging economies from these shocks. We develop a DSG model that have this feature of balance sheet effect and limited dollarization that are able to replicate this result, this empirical fact. And using the model, we also show that limited dollarization amplified the effects of global capital flows, and deploying foreign exchange rate intervention response to capital flows is welfare improving. And our empirical and theoretical results highlight the role of FXI for dealing with the global capital, and the rationale that probably the strength of using foreign exchange rate intervention is higher when you have dollarization. Okay, and that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Pablo. So we'll take the questions at the end. So you go ahead, Gabriel, with your presentation.
Okay, thank you very much. May you see my screen? Yes?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I will put the clock.
I'll tell you at 10 minutes when you have 10 minutes left.
Okay,
Okay.
Thank you, Adel. Thanks for the opportunity to present this paper. This paper is a joint work with Paul Castillo, belong to the Central Bank Reserve of Peru. And also Paul belongs to the Department of Economics of the Universidad Católica of Peru. And Arumi Aseagua, that she is studying the postgraduate studies in Harvard now. The title is that the Central Bank of Peru responds to exchange rate movements, a Bayesian estimation of a new Keynesian DSG model with FX interventions. This is the outline, introduction, the model, empirical results, conclusion, we include in an appendix some extra tables related to extra experiments. Okay, introduction. The Taylor rule is an accurate description of how central banks implement the monetary policy in advanced economies. In emerging economies, the role of exchange rate in setting monetary policy rate is more complex, and we have at least two reasons: less developed financial markets and financial dollarization. Some emerging countries use the interest rate to smooth exchange rate fluctuations. For example, some references are Calvo and Reinhardt, and Mohanty and Cloud. Other central banks in emerging markets tend to rely on a larger number of monetary policy instruments as the use of international reserve and FX interventions. There are some references: Adelan Tovar, Austria et al., Failardo, Benes, and Gopinath. There is evidence that the FX intervention and the interest rate setting are related. How? FX intervention reduces the need of adjusting the domestic currency, the domestic interest rate, to limit a large depreciation of the domestic currency. And on the other hand, FX interventions could contribute to isolate domestic credit markets from the volatility and fluctuation of international financial markets. What are our goals? Our main goal is to assess the role played by the exchange rate and FX intervention in the setting of the interest rate of the Central Bank of Peru. Other goal is to measure the response, impulse response functions of key variables: GDP, consumption, investment, exchange rates, interest rate, inflation, for example, to 4 shocks: productivity shock in the manufacturing sector, cost push shock, risk premium shock, and finally a term of trade shock. And the final goal is to measure the contribution using the forecast error variance decomposition of these variables to different shocks, or to the 4 shocks mentioned. Why Peru? Peru is a small open economy, a small open commodity exporting economy with partial dollarization. And this is a very interesting case. Since 2003, the Peruvian Central Bank, BCRP, follows an inflation targeting IT regime that uses the short-term interest rate as its main instrument. The central bank complements the use of interest rate using FX interventions. In the last 20 years, the Monetary Policy Authority has managed to keep the inflation low and stable. More things about why Peru. Since 2004, Peru faced an increasing volatility of capital flows as gradually gained access to the global financial markets, and it became more active in the use of macroprudential tools, including what is known as a lean against the wind type FX intervention strategy. For example, during first quarter of 2007 and second quarter of 2008, the central bank bought foreign currency for an amount equivalent to 18.5% of GDP in order to smooth the impact on the domestic economy of abundant capital inflows. On the other hand, during the financial crisis, 2008 quarter 3 and 2009 quarter 1, the central bank sold, that is the opposite to the previous notation. The central bank sold foreign currency for an amount equivalent to 8.4% of GDP, a response that contributed to limit the impact of the sudden stop of capital flows that the global financial generated on domestic credit conditions. The model is based on Smith, Grohe, and Uribe 2017. It's a model of an open a small open economy composed by household, two productive export sectors, a monetary policy authority, and a foreign sector. The central bank set its monetary policy using a Taylor rule that responds to inflation, output gap, and change in the exchange rate. The central bank used a sterilized FX intervention to reduce the volatility of the exchange rate as in Faltermeyer 2017. That is, this is a model, something like a standard in the DSG literature for a small open economies, but we include a explicit FX intervention rule following the contribution of Faltermeyer et al. 2017. I will not enter in details about the model. We say only, I will say that the model has a sector of household. Okay, we have some equation there. The notation appear below. We have a sector of firms, okay, where we have commodity export firms and manufacturing firms. That is two kinds of firms. We have also the final good producers, okay, when we have intermediate good, how are transformed into final good and aggregate demand of final goods in the last equation. And we have a portion of the model dedicated to Phillips curve, okay. The intermediate good producer set price optimally. We have an exogenous probability of changing price. We follow Calvo and Jung using this probability and the assumption related to that. Following Benigno and Woodford, we write the third order condition using another auxiliary variables and to represent, to have a non-linear representation of the Phillips curve. The foreign sector is composed by a non-traditional export, the term of trade, the relative price of exported goods, and we modify slightly the uncovered interest rate parity following adoption 2008. And we have an equation for the country risk premium. Okay. Finally, we are closing the model with the equation of the GDP, the total investment. Finally, the monetary policy. We have a standard monetary policy, but we include the potential response of the interest rate fluctuation on the exchange rate or variation in the exchange rate. And we include a explicit FX intervention rule given by the second equation in the screen. The parameter delta FX is fundamental for us because that is the response of the central bank to movements in exchange rate and using FX interventions, selling or value. Choice of priors. In general, the parameters associated to a steady state of the model are calibrated to the Peruvian economy using quarterly data, and these parameters or most of the prior are obtained from a current quarterly model proposed by Salas in 2011 and Vega et al. In 2009. This is a very large DSG model that the Central Bank of Peru had some years ago. For standard deviation of structural shocks and parameters associated to monetary policy, we use inverse gamma distribution as priors. For persistent parameters, we use beta distribution as priors. In general, all priors are in line with the literature on a small open economy, which are exposed to commodity price shocks. We have here the prior distributions, okay, for the monetary policy parameters with the prior mean and the prior standard deviation. We have the table 2 about the persistent parameters, prior mean, prior standard deviation. or the, prior for other parameters, okay? That is, as I say before, all the priors are in line with standard literature, or some of them are extracted from the large DAG model of the Central Bank of Peru. The data, we have some observable variables, and they are GDP, total export, real private consumption, consumer price index, monetary policy rate, nominal exchange rate, and term of trade. The data, the frequency is quarter, from 97 first quarter to 2017 fourth quarter. The source are the web page of the Central Bank of Peru. We estimate 4 different versions of the baseline model. What are the difference? The difference is the restrictions imposed to the Taylor rule and whether or not the FX intervention rule is active. We will show it in 1 minute. We split the sample in 2 subsamples. From 1997 to 2003, which correspond to the pre-IT regime, inflation targeting regime. And from 2004 to 2017, which correspond to the IT regime, inflation targeting regime in Peru. That is the 4 models. The first model consider that the central bank change or react the interest rate to movements in the exchange rate. That is, the parameter phi is positive and strictly larger than 0. On the other side, the monetary policy and the central bank intervened in the FX market. That is, the parameter delta FX is strictly positive. The second model consider that the monetary policy rule reacts to the exchange rate, but there are not intervention in the FX market. The third model is a model where the monetary policy rule does not react to the movements in the exchange rate, but there are an intervention in the FX market. And the fourth model is the more restricted model. There are not reaction of the policy rate to the movements in the exchange rate, and there are also no intervention in the FX market. How we evaluate the 4 model? We use the marginal log density to rank the estimated model. What we obtained that for the pre-IT and IT regimens, the model that clearly performs better is the model 3. That is the model where the policy rate does not react to movements in the exchange rate, but there are a clear intervention in the FX market by the central bank. This result is consistent with IT, that is a IT regime, plus control risk framework that the central bank used to implement its monetary policy. That is, it used the short-term interest rate to anchor inflation expectation, and it used FX intervention and reserve requirements to limit risk associated to financial dollarization. In this table, this is the low marginal density and the bias factor, and we observe clearly that the model 3 is the better model in terms of performance, and the model 4 is the benchmark because it's our more restricted model. There is not intervention in the FX market, and there are no reaction to the movements of the exchange rate. We have some tables, but we will not discuss in detail these, but we have tables where we show the posterior estimated and the confidence intervals. But we may summarize these in the following issues.
Sorry, Gabriel, 10 minutes.
Thank you. The size of the response of the interest rate to inflation that is the parameter P phi, is close to 2, which is consistent with an integral rule that satisfies the Taylor principle, and that guarantees that the interest inflation rate is anchored to the inflation target. The response of the interest rate to the output gap is greater than 1, which is consistent with a contracyclical response of the monetary policy, particularly in the case of aggregate demand shocks. Here, the response of FX intervention to fluctuation, that is the parameter, the more important parameter, delta FX, has become stronger during the IT period. That is almost 9 times larger than in the pre-inflation target. This finding is consistent with a more active participation of the Central Bank of Peru in the FX market during the IT regime, or in other terms, is a better signaling of the lean against the wind type of FX intervention. We apply some statistics to see if the identification is adequate, and we pass the test. We will pass this very fast, and we enter to the impulse response functions. We estimate the Bayesian impulse response for the model 3, and we compare with the more restrictive version, that is model 4. For 4 structural shock: productivity of the manufacturing sector, cost push, risk premium, and term of trade. Overall, the estimate impulse response function showed that the FX intervention of the Central Bank of Peru are effective, reducing the exchange rate volatility and therefore the inflation rate. This result is in agreement with the literature branch that says that emerging economies like Peru, FX intervention and IT regime contribute to the same goal, that is keeping inflation rate within the inflation target. We have here the pre-IT impulse response. The blue lines are the model 3, that is the better model in terms of low marginal density. And the red lines are the model 4, which are the restrictive model. Instead of see each figure, we summarize, I will summarize the principal findings, okay? What happened with, there is a productivity shock. During the pre-IT regime, an increase in productivity generate a persistent increase in GDP, consumption, and investment. Also, a decreasing inflation rate as marginal cost falls and trade balance improves. The falling inflation rate more than offsets the effect of the increase in the GDP growth on the Taylor rule. The Central Bank of Peru responds by cutting its policy rate and purchasing in the FX market. In the other regime, that is during the inflation targeting regime, the nominal exchange rate and the inflation rate fall less, which induce the central bank to cut to a lesser extent its interest rate. Thus, in this sense, the central bank generates lower GDP volatility and lower inflation volatility. Results are qualitatively similar during the pre-IT regime and during the IT regime, but quantitatively they are very different. Why? The magnitude of the parameter delta. During the pre-IT regime, this parameter is equal to 0.6, but during the IT regime, this parameter is equal to 5.3. That is 9 times larger. That means that the Central Bank of Peru adopted an aggressive intervention in the FX market. What about a cost
Sorry,
shock?
Gabriel, 5 minutes.
Okay, I will pass. Term of trade shock, okay. The mechanism is very similar, okay? It's very similar. The difference is that the parameter delta, that is the principal explanation for the difference between the performance pre-IT and post-IT regimens. because the parameter delta is larger, then that implies a more aggressive intervention in the FX market, and that explains the lower volatility in consumption and in GDP, in inflation also, due to FX intervention. What about the forecast error variance decomposition? The productivity shock is the more important, some about 40% or in the long term. The term of trade has increased from 10% to 20% to the IT period. That is important. That is the picture in both regimes. And what about the forecast error variance decomposition of the interest rate? Productivity is playing a lot, and the term of the term of trade shocks also are contributed significantly. Conclusions. We estimate a quarterly DSG model for a small open economy based on its micro-behavior for the Peruvian economy. The model considers household, two productive sector, a monetary policy authority, and a foreign sector. We include a tailored rule that responds to inflation, output gap, a change in the nominal exchange rate. We enrich the model by incorporating an explicit sterilized FX intervention rules that the central bank used to reduce the volatility of the exchange rate. We estimate 4 different versions of the model, reacting or not reacting to the exchange rate in the monetary policy rule, or intervening or not intervening in the FX intervention rule, in the FX market, sorry. We estimate the model for 2 samples, pre-IT and IT, and we finish with that. The best model is the model 3 that considers that the monetary policy does not react to the movements on exchange rate, but the central bank intervenes aggressively in the FX market. Pre-IT and post-IT. Post-IT is more aggressive. The interest rate responds to the inflation rate, the output gap, the response to FX intervention to change in the nominal exchange rate. The parameter delta is almost 9 times bigger than the pre-inflation period. The evidence support the literature branch that in emerging economies like Peru, FX intervention and IT regimes contribute to the same goal of keeping the inflation rate within the inflation target. And finally, the FX intervention of the central bank, according to our results, are effective reducing the exchange rate volatility, but also reducing the inflation rate volatility and the GDP volatility. Thank you very much, Adler.
Thank you, Gabriel. So we will take questions at the end, as we said before. So I'll go ahead and share my presentation now. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes. We are in the second slide.
Yes.
Okay.
Can you see there?
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay, so this is joint work with my colleagues Kyung-Suk Chang and Xijiao Wang from the IMF. The usual disclaimer applies that these are views of the authors and not the IMF or its management of executive board. So like Juan Pablo and Gabriel already mentioned before this presentation, a large number of countries have adopted the inflation target in the last 2 decades. And this has been particularly striking in emerging market and developing economies, which have gone from about 20% of them having IT regimes in the early 2000s to nearly 80% of them before the pandemic, while advanced economies have done that earlier in earlier decades. And the conventional wisdom at the very beginning of this, at least, was that free floating of the exchange rate was an essential element to the IT regime for 2 reasons. First, because the exchange rate channel needed to operate to make sure that interest rate will have sufficient power to control inflation. So not just the credit channel, but also the exchange rate channel was considered important. But perhaps more importantly, because it was considered at the beginning that multiple objectives could jeopardize the ultimate goal of controlling inflation. So trying to target the exchange rate could undermine the objective of targeting inflation as the main goal of the central bank. Now, in practice, what we have seen is that emerging market economies have continued managing exchange rates, basically deploying foreign exchange intervention throughout this period. And this is something that Juan Pablo also mentioned before. And you can see that in the chart here to the right that shows basically the average absolute value of FX intervention as a share of GDP for advanced and emerging markets separately. And you can see that emerging markets have continued deploying FX intervention in sizable amounts and much higher than in advanced economies, even after adopting inflation targeting. So there is an ongoing debate about the consistency of using FX intervention in the context of IT and what are the implications for inflation objectives. Now, there is a large body of work on FX intervention as a macroeconomic tool. The earlier work focused on FXI or equivalent policy instruments for capital flow management. And more recent work, including work that Juan Pablo and Gabriel in their papers have shown, have focused on FXI as a macro stabilization tool. Now, the vast majority of the work so far has been mainly theoretical or modeling, and there has been very little empirical work on how FX intervention actually is conducted under IT. So specifically, how it's conducted, whether FXI under inflation targeting responds to inflation objectives or actually is a reflection of dual objective of both targeting the exchange rate and inflation, and whether, perhaps this is the most important one, whether FX intervention is actually detrimental to the achieving inflation targets. So in this paper, we try to fill this gap precisely by documenting the use of FX intervention under inflation targeting regimes and non-inflation targeting regimes, and then exploring the implications of the use of this tool within IT, especially for inflation outcomes. So in this particular paper, we focus on 12 advanced economies and 36 emerging market economies that have independent monetary policies. And so we don't look at currency boards or even advanced economies that are within the Eurozone, for example. And we use quarterly data for the period of 2000 to 2017. Now, as many of you may know, FX intervention is a very sensitive topic, and often countries don't publish data on FXI, especially in other regions. Latin America is an exception in that regard, where there is pretty good data. But if you want to cover a broader set of countries, it's very difficult to have actual FX intervention. So as part of this work and related work, we have constructed proxies of FX intervention by using balance of payment data on changes in reserves and stripping the return on reserves, which is an automatic component, to infer the actual transactions in the spot market, and also adding to that available information on FX operations with derivatives, meaning forwards and swaps. So as I said, this data covers, in this paper, we cover 48 countries, but I'll take the opportunity to advertise another piece of work that we have recently completed on a new data set on FX intervention that covers 122 countries. And the link is there if you are interested to look at it. So what we do first in this paper is to present some stylized facts on how FX intervention is conducted in both in advanced and emerging market economies. And here you can see the frequency of FX intervention plotted as in percent of GDP. So you can see, for example, how frequent are interventions of a 0.25% of GDP in a given quarter. At 0.75% of GDP, and so on. And you can see it for all countries, for advanced economies, and for emerging and developing economies. And what is clear from this picture is that FX intervention is limited in advanced economies, both in IT and non-IT regimes, which are plotted in blue and red here, while it is quite pervasive in emerging and developing economies. Again, this is what Juan Pablo was mentioning before, that FX intervention is very commonly done even in IT regimes in emerging market economies. And you can see that there is a difference in the magnitude and frequency of FX intervention in emerging market economies between IT and non-IT countries, but still in the IT group, which is the red line, there is still quite significant amount of intervention.
Gustavo?
Yeah,
Gustavo?
Juan Pablo.
No, because I still look into your second page of your PDF file. So I don't know, maybe you move forward, but it's still, I don't know if the other
Seriously?
participant we have been.
Yes.
Okay, let me see.
Second page.
So I thought that was a long motivation, but
No, I was, let me see. For some reason it stopped sharing. Let me see.
okay, now I see your 5 page of
Can you see the 3 charts?
Yeah, yes. Now I see the 3 charts.
Okay, sorry. So then I'll go over this again very briefly. But you also missed this one. So in this slide, just to say, this is describing the data we use and the fact that we construct a proxy of FXI. Here is a link to the data set that we have recently published with those estimates for 122 countries. Can you see now the charts again? Okay, perfect. So I was saying these charts shows how frequent countries use FXI, and you can see the difference between advanced and emerging market economies, with advanced economies using much less frequent than emerging market. And both in advanced economies, both IT and non-IT seem to be used more or less at the same frequency, still limited. In emerging markets, there is a difference between IT and non-IT regimes. So IT countries actually use less intervention or less frequently, but still quite sizable and frequent. So another aspect of the intervention that is important is whether there is an asymmetry in how it's conducted or not, meaning whether countries tend to purchase more than they sell effects, or is it two-sided. And this is important because it has implications for what is the impact on the exchange rate and potentially on inflation through pass-through, right? For just to point to this, a country that intervenes significantly to prevent appreciation of the currency would not allow the deflationary pressures from appreciated currency to feed into or contribute to lowering inflation, right? So while a country that while allowing the exchange rate to depreciate would actually feed into inflation through pass-through. So the direction of inflation in a systematic way could also be important for what we see in terms of pass-through. And here, to explore this, we constructed a simple indicator of symmetry, which is for a given window of time, we use different windows. We look at the sum of FX intervention in percent of GDP over the absolute value of the same variable, which means basically will give us an index that goes between -1 and 1. -1 being the case where a country always sells effects. It would be theoretical because you will reach the zero lower bound pretty quickly. But in theory, that's possible. And the value 1 would correspond to the case of a country that is only purchasing FX all the time. And 0 would be a completely two-sided, where you see as much sales as purchases. And then we run a very simple regression like the one that you see here, that shows the alpha, the estimation of alpha would be the group average value of the symmetry index, and the beta would be the differential effect of being in an IT regime. And to the left, you can see the data, the results. And immediately you can see that the average symmetry is 0.329, which means that on average, if you look at the whole sample of countries, the full sample of countries, they tend to be purchasing more than selling. But there is an offsetting effect in the beta of -0.1, which indicates that IT regimes tend to do less than that. So they have they are closer to a two-sided FX intervention policy. Now, when we break down the sample into advanced and emerging market economies, though, we see a very big difference. And for emerging markets, actually, the coefficients are insignificant in both cases, again, indicating that the value is we cannot reject the hypothesis that the value is close to zero, which means that it's mostly two-sided, while the result for emerging market economies is the opposite, that is clearly one-sided, with some offset or negative differential effect for IT regimes, but relatively small in terms of reducing the value that 0.357 towards zero. Now, of course, an argument that one can always make is that emerging markets typically purchase FX precisely because they are concerned about having reserve buffers, and they need to buy them in the market to build up those buffers. So precautionary motives can be a reason behind this. And that's what we do in the last column in this table. We control for the level of reserves, in this case, a simple metric of reserve to GDP, to see if countries that have more reserves tend to buy less. And indeed, we find a negative coefficient there, as you can see, and highly significant. But the coefficient alpha is still very, very big and actually increases, indicating that even if we take into account precautionary motives for FX purchases, we see a two-sided intervention, a one-sided intervention policy in emerging markets on average. Finally, to be a little bit more sophisticated, since we haven't really looked at the behavior of the exchange rate itself, we construct another index of the degree of exchange rate management, which you can see here as is the standard deviation of FX intervention on a given period of time over the same standard deviation of intervention plus the standard deviation of the exchange rate, which can be either relative to the US dollar or the nominal and effective exchange rate. It will give very similar results. So with this degree, this index will basically take value 0 if there is no volatility in intervention over time. You could still have some intervention over time, but as long as there is no volatility, you're not really managing the exchange rate. And that would correspond mostly with a free floating regime. And a value 1 would correspond basically with a peg. And in the chart to the left, you can see how the distribution of this index for advanced and emerging market economies separately, and within each of these groups for IT and non-IT regimes. And it's quite striking to see that for advanced economies, the distributions for IT and non-IT is very different. IT regimes have values that are very close to 0, while non-IT are much more concentrated in higher values, precisely indicating that there is a much higher degree of management of the exchange rate in non-IT regime than in IT regimes for the advanced economies group. This is not the case, though, for emerging market economies, where both groups, IT and non-IT, have quite similar distributions, indicating that the degree of exchange rate management in emerging markets is broadly the same for IT and non-IT. Of course, at the end of the day, we wanted to ask what is the link between FXI and inflation? Juan Pablo, you had a question?
10 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks for taking the role of the chair. So since we want to link FXI to inflation, let me say something very briefly about inflation. And of course, we could talk a lot about the patterns of inflation in emerging markets and advanced economies. But just to be brief, you can see here in this chart some simple statistics of inflation in advanced economies and in emerging market economies, both for deviations from target as well as deviations of inflation expectations from target, either measured for the current year, for next year, or 12-month ahead period. So different metrics of inflation expectations. And in the first group, and you can also measure deviations from the target range, meaning deviations from the bounds, outside the bounds. To be short, what you see here is that for advanced economies, which is the first row, there is a systematic undershooting of inflation targeting over this period, which is not surprising. We have seen deflation in many of these countries, and including undershooting relative to the target range, while the opposite is true for emerging and developing economies, where there has been an overshooting of inflation targeting consistently or frequently. In fact, as you can see here, about the average overshooting of the target is about 76 basis points or 50 basis points above the target range. So just to summarize the key stylized facts so far, we are saying that FXI and exchange rate management is limited and two-sided in advanced economies, while in emerging market economies, we see that FXI and exchange rate management is very pervasive and is mostly one-sided with a bias toward FX purchasing, buying effects, even after controlling for precautionary motives. And we see some differences between IT and non-IT within the emerging market group, but they are relatively small. On the inflation front, on the other hand, advanced economies have show consistent undershooting of inflation targets, and the opposite is true with for emerging market economies, which show consistent overshooting of these targets. So the question is this type of pattern of FXI that we see in emerging markets related to the overshooting of inflation outcomes or inflation targets? So to shed some light on this, which is at the end the key question of the paper, we start by trying to shed light on whether the use of FX intervention points to a single or a dual objective. And to do that, we estimate a relatively simple reaction function of FX intervention that reacts to deviation of inflation or inflation expectations from the target, which is the first term in that equation, the first term to the right, or whether it reacts to the exchange rate and different lags of it. And the idea here is to see whether the use of intervention is meant to influence inflation outcomes, meaning suppose a country that is facing inflationary pressures, right, could in principle sell FX to try to appreciate the currency, or at least not to let it depreciate if it's facing a shock, in order to support bringing the inflation down. So the key is whether intervention goes in the direction of supporting the inflation target or not, and that will be captured by the first term. And you can see in the table here, which shows the results of this estimation for different measures of inflation, either actual inflation deviations from target or inflation expectations deviations from target. And we have a number of different specifications with different controls. But what you can see basically is that while in all of them, the exchange rate is very powerful with a very significant, statistically significant and sizable coefficient, meaning that FXI is responding to the exchange rate, we don't see any evidence that the FXI is responding to inflation developments. So in a way, FXI does not seem to be responding to concerns about where inflation is heading, but it is responding to the exchange rate itself. Next, what we do is we look at the direct link between the FXI and inflation outcomes. And to do that, we first construct a metric of FXI over a certain period of time. I think in these results that I'm going to show, 5 minutes, thanks to Juan Pablo. We look at 8 quarters. So what is the impact of FXI conducted in the previous 8 quarters on the probability of overshooting the inflation target or overshooting the upper band of the inflation target range? And we control for a number of factors, including the exchange rate and the lag movements in the exchange rates, the interest rate itself, the output gap, and a number of global factors, including the VIX, world GDP, world inflation, and the 10-year treasury yield. So because we are controlling for exchange rate movements, what we're trying to capture is the effect of FXI on the inflation outcomes, that in addition to the effect that we have on the exchange rate. So in a way, if FXI is effective in moving the exchange rate in itself through the average pass-through in the economy, it will have an impact on inflation itself and the probability of hitting the target. But because we are controlling for that, we are capturing any effect in addition to that. And we can talk about what we have in mind for what is the intuition for that. But here you can see basically the results, and there are 2 sets of results. One is looking at the probability of overshooting the inflation target, and second, the probability of overshooting the inflation target range. So basically overshooting the upper band of the range. And for different specifications, you can see that there is a strong effect. These are the marginal effects of the probability estimation. So to be precise, for example, if you take column number 3, this number 16.8 would tell us that a 1% average FXI over the last 8 quarters, tends to increase by 16.8% the probability of overshooting the inflation target. And then if you look at the upper band, overshooting the upper band, the probability is about 13%. So this suggests indeed that the conduct of FXI may indeed have a bearing on the likelihood of hitting the inflation target. Now, why this could be? Again, one possibility is that by conducting FXI, especially if it is in a manner that is not consistent with the inflation target per se, as I was showing before, there is no evidence that the FXI is actually responding to the inflationary developments, but actually responding to the exchange rate. And by doing that, the central bank may be signaling that it has a different objective, or at least multiple objectives, and maybe undermining its inflationary objective by basically affecting perception in the market of the commitment to achieve the inflation target. So in other words, it may be affecting inflation expectations by conducting FXI. So we look at this, we do the same exercise by looking at inflation expectations and the probability of overshooting the target. And we have another table with the target range again. And we have similar results. We see that the conduct of FXI tends to be associated with an overshooting of inflation expectations above the target or above the target range. I'll conclude here, just wrapping up, summarizing. There is an ongoing debate about the contours of inflation targeting, and particularly the use of FX intervention under IT. And the key questions are whether IT is used as an instrument to achieve the inflation objective, or actually an instrument aimed at the second objective, which might be the exchange rate. And despite the extensive debate on this, most of the work has been modeling, and there has been relatively limited work on FXI under IT, and this is what we try to do in this paper to fill the gap Our main findings are that in advanced economies, FXI is limited and two-sided, both in IT and non-IT regimes. While in emerging market economies, we find that FXI is pervasive and mostly one-sided, with a bias toward purchasing effects, even after controlling for precautionary motives. And this is true both for IT and non-IT, although there are some differences. And now, we don't find any evidence that FXI responds to contemporaneous inflation developments, but we do have evidence that the FXI responds to the exchange rate movements. So these two together indicate that there are dual inflation and exchange rate objectives by most central banks in emerging market economies. And then looking at whether FXI actually affects inflationary outcomes, we do find that there is weaker anchoring of inflation expectations and higher propensity to overshoot inflation targets in emerging markets than in advanced economies, and this seems to be associated with the use of FXI. So let me stop there. Maybe Juan Pablo, Gabriel, we can open the floor for questions, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So I'll stop sharing.
Can I ask a question?
Please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I have a question for Juan Pablo and another one for Gustavo. Juan Pablo, my question is, this global capital flow series that you have in the VAR, and then you represent as an interest rate shock in the DSG model. I was wondering, how does it commute with global commodity prices? Because then in the DSG, the effect will be quite different if it's a decrease in the foreign interest rate shock, or if terms of trade are increasing. And I'm guessing that this should be part of the story, because it's like a global movement. The war have more appetite for emerging countries, and at the same time, commodity prices are booming. So maybe I think it will be worth to include that in the VAR in some form. And then for Gustavo, there's something that it wasn't clear for me from your presentation. I think that you're always looking at changes in foreign reserves, but there is no idea, at least as I understood, whether those interventions are sterilized or not. Because I'm guessing that's a huge difference between IT and non-IT countries. In IT countries, I will guess they're mostly sterilized, but when you look at non-IT countries, they're all over the place. And maybe that's the difference, is that an expansion in reserves is contractionary in M, and the amount of money, and that is generating the results. So it's not obvious how to measure it, but I wanted to be sure if I understood correctly how you're measuring things.
Thank you, Javier. Juan Pablo, do you want to go ahead?
Okay. Yes. So your let me see if I understood your point, Javier. So your point is to try to distinguish better what is coming out of the global, because in the model is the foreign interest rate, and then in the data could be something that is related beyond. So just a movement in the risk-free rate, and probably yes, maybe we can try to refine a little bit the way that you identify a global shock that is just a change in the the risk-free rate, and try to separate from the global commodity prices. So we have another work with another colleagues that have this idea of intervention as a response to commodity price, but we never took the two approaches together, but probably is one thing that we can think about. But we see something like the intervention also regarding commodity booms, but the empirical pattern is different. But we do a country case study that we see that when you have commodity booms and with intervention, you attenuate the exchange rate appreciation and the and other booms related. But is other type of empirical facts that we have, but probably we can better identification regarding what is in the data and what is the model, and to make these two things more closely pointed out to the same kind of shocks that we have. Okay, thank you.
So Javier, the question on sterilized versus not unsterilized, indeed, it's a key question. I think for non-IT countries, as you pointed out, they may conduct unsterilized interventions, and this could be an issue. It's not straightforward how to think about sterilized versus non-sterilized, because you will need to see what happens with the monetary base simultaneously to the changes in reserves. And the question is, if it moves at all, is an epsilon, would it mean that they was not sterilized or not? So you need to start thinking about what is the threshold to consider that. But it's a very good point. Having said that, I think, like you said also, in IT regimes, I think it's safer to assume that most of these have been sterilized, and we know that if we look at the last decade or so, IT regimes conducting FXI, I think it's pretty clear that the vast majority was sterilized. Now, when you get this, when you hit the zero lower bound in the interest rate, then what is sterilized and what is non-sterilized, it becomes very blurred, right? Because then you're paying zero interest on your sterilization instruments, which is very close to money. So so there are other issues as well, but I think it's a good point. But maybe the most important part of my answer is, at the end of the day, what we're interested in is whether FXI tends to affect the likelihood of hitting the inflation target, or whether in a way undermines that, right? And when we conduct that, we control for the interest rate, precisely as a way to try to control for the monetary policy stance. Now, if you were to conduct unsterilized interventions, then in principle, it would affect the interest rate itself. And if our regression is properly done, we should be controlling for that. But I think it's a very good point. Unfortunately, I haven't seen any data out there. Even us, we have done a lot of work, like I was saying before, putting together data on FX intervention estimates. But it's hard to come by data that disentangles sterilized versus non-sterilized interventions. Hopefully, we can do it at some point. But it's a good point. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I have a question. Andres Fernandez here.
Hi, Andres. Go ahead.
Hi. How are you doing, guys? I apologize, but I arrived late, so I only managed to hear half of Gustavo's presentation. Apologies to the rest. So two reactions, Gustavo. I was surprised by the big difference between ITers and non-ITers in advanced economies. So what is your going on there?
Sorry, Andres, big difference in what?
In the use of FX intervention, if I got it correctly. You showed the distribution plot.
Yeah.
And in advanced economies, there was a big difference between ITers and non-ITers.
Maybe I can share my screen briefly.
It was one of the plots towards the half of the presentation, I guess.
This one?
No,
can you see it?
No, the distribution plot.
This one.
That one. Yeah, that one on the left.
Yes. Yes. This is an index that we created, which we call it the degree of exchange rate management, which gives you what is the relative volatility of FXI with respect to the exchange rate, right? So if you have zero volatility in FXI, means that you're not intervening at all, and that value is zero. If you intervene a lot to the point that the exchange rate is not moving, you will have a peg, right? And that coefficient would be 1. That ratio would be 1. So we plot that for advanced and emerging markets, and you see, like you say exactly, Andres, there is a very big difference in advanced economies between IT and non-IT, with the non-IT countries actually showing a much higher degree or a concentration on higher values, which mean that they tend to intervene quite a bit, while IT and advanced economies don't do that. I suppose you may be wondering which are these countries, and I think I should know the answer to that, but I don't have it in the top of my mind. There are some countries though that I know intervene a lot, and maybe they are weird animals. But if you take the financial centers like Switzerland, for example, they tend to intervene quite a lot, in part because they face very large capital flows tied to the global financial cycle. So there may be some of that in there. I will need to dig deeper in, to find out which is in that group. But
yeah, it would be interesting to see what animals do you have there in that basket.
Right.
And I was also thinking, so the global financial cycle might be a good hypothesis. I was also thinking about what Javier mentioned about commodity exporters. You might have there some commodity exporters that they don't do IT, and this is basically their instrument, no?
The oil exporters mainly.
Yeah.
We could have some. I mean, most of the oil exporters that I can think of have pegs, right? So that they may be affecting this, but we don't include pegs here because it cannot affect this precisely because we don't include pegs. We only have countries with independent monetary policies. So I would need to find out who is in there. I think that's a very good point. I'm trying to see the paper if I have the list of countries.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Maybe you mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation, but do you in any way include or control by central banks that have a financial stability mandate? So is that something that you guys look at? Because if you have a dual mandate, then in addition to brand stability, then you might use that as your one of the tools to accomplish this.
Right.
This goal, no?
No, we haven't looked at that per se. I think indeed FXI could play a role from a financial stability point of view, although it's less obvious whether it's a preferred instrument to macroprudential tools, right? But I think it's a good point. We haven't looked at that in detail. But going back to your previous point, I think what we have with countries we have in there are Australia, Japan, Sweden, Switzerland, mostly. Yeah.
Okay.
So it's I know for a fact. I mean, Australia is an interesting case because they tend to intervene, although they tend to say that they don't, and it's because they only publish intervention data that when they intervene with the purpose of affecting the exchange rate, but they don't consider intervention any purchases that are meant for other reasons. Now, of course, we don't take that into account because in our view, what matters is what you do, not what you said that you intend to do. But again, beyond that, I don't have much more to give you as an answer. I think it's a good question nonetheless. Juan Pablo?
Yes, no, I was having a minor question regarding this FXI reaction function. So because you tried this forward-looking, I mean, reaction to the inflation expectation relative to the target. But in that question, you have two dimensions. So the concern of the deviation with the target and a prospective or forecasting view of the how you value the inflation target. So I don't know if you tried to use lags of the inflation deviation instead to have the forecast, because you have the exchange rate in that, because in the way that you try, maybe you are talking 2 points. So maybe these central banks are less forward-looking in the way that they see the deviation, or maybe they are not using the foreign exchange rate intervention for that target, but for me was kind of, in the way that you made the regression, you are considering the two part together. So maybe, I don't know, I know that you have the exchange rate as well, so maybe you have multi-collinearity in the regression, but maybe you can think of if you start to use the foreign exchange rate intervention when you have accumulated deviation beyond what is the forecast.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean.
Okay, so that is so maybe you are less forward-looking, and then you have to react with the foreign exchange rate intervention. But it's a minor point. So
yeah,
because
no, I think
it was curious regarding the way that you
right.
put the reaction function for the foreign intervention.
If I remember correctly, Juan Pablo, I think we also run the regression without controlling for the exchange rate changes, and you still find nothing on responding to deviation of inflation expectation from the target. So I think part of the answer might be there, but I think we will need to explore a little bit more. Thank you, Juan Pablo. Maybe I can ask you one, sorry, Camilo?
Yeah, if I didn't mean to interrupt. So I have a quick question for you, Gustavo, also related to some of the points raised by Andres and a little bit on what Gabriel's work touched on. So you found that there is not a strong relationship between between FXI and inflation movements, and that it responds more to exchange rate movements, right? But then I was wondering, like, the typical justification in IT countries for FXI is that it tends to mitigate, or it tries, or it aims to mitigate the volatility of the exchange rate so that it does not pass through to, or doesn't create volatility of inflation, right? Which is something that these countries would find like very hurtful. So I was wondering if you checked whether, the hypothesis that it does not respond to inflation somehow takes that into account, that maybe it's because it tries to act maybe in a preemptive way on the volatility of the exchange rate so that it does not impact or doesn't create future volatility of inflation.
I think it's a very good question, and in fact, I didn't present this, but we have a few tables in the paper where we look at the correlation of FXI and the exchange rate when, depending on where you are in terms of inflation expectation. For example, if you're undershooting your target, are you most likely to intervene to prevent an appreciation that would further reduce inflation, or the opposite? So is your intervention policy basically consistent with moving expectations toward the target or not? And we find no evidence of that, similar to what we find in the regression. So you can see we have a table with that in the paper. So in a way, we have sliced this question in many different ways, and we don't find, maybe there is another way of doing it, but we don't find any evidence that interventions are conducted in a way that would increase the probability of succeeding in hitting the target. If anything, we find evidence of the opposite, that interventions tend to go in the opposite direction.
Okay, so neither with inflation nor with hitting the target itself.
Right, and that's why we say that this is an indication of dual objectives rather than conducting FXI as an additional instrument to try to increase the probability of hitting the target.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you one question, Juan Pablo, if I may, on liability dollarization. I think in your paper I think you focus mostly on, at least on the empirical part of it, on deposit dollarization, right? And that tends to be very stable, and indeed it has, in some countries, has come down over time. Peru is, I think, is a clear case of that, but it tends to be a very slow moving variable, and I take it that we can take it as a feature of the country. But when you think about dollarization in balance sheet of corporates, for example, there is an interesting question about endogeneity of that, right? Because rather than being an exogenous variable, it's a choice variable. And the question is, if if you have an FX intervention policy or an exchange rate policy that tends to stabilize the exchange rate, you actually could induce more liability dollarization, and you have a vicious circle in a way. So I was wondering whether you have thought about that and whether it's possible to model it somehow.
Yeah. Oh yes, sure. Yeah. We are concerned regarding that we are taking. I mean, in the model, it's more clear that we are taking as given the degree of partial dollarization in the corporate sector. So that is one thing. So we don't have this loop feedback vicious circle that you are saying that if you intervene, you make that the foreign exchange rate market develop less, and that create an incentive to have a higher dollarization as well. So I agree with that. So we don't have that. We're taking regarding the data. Yes, the fair answer is that we take Libre data set because it's very comprehensive to have a lot of, and in that study they show that there is a huge correlation between loan dollarization, credit dollarization, and deposit dollarization, and since the sample is more big for deposit dollarization, we take that data because we assemble this data of capital flows, global capital flows with that database, and then we end with 45 countries in that period of time. So that we use. So maybe we have to work better in the financial data to come up with a bigger data set and to take more loans. But the point is that I don't know, they have 150 country Libre of data of deposit dollarization, and we assemble that data to use that data is a way, but we are concerned that it's a proxy and probably it's slow moving and it's not perfect with the credit dollarization that we're trying to stress for the corporate sector. You're right, but we take at face value that for them, they use that data as a way to mimic credit dollarization in the period that they use. Okay, but you're right.
No, I agree with you. In fact, I don't think it's easy to find data on corporate balance sheet, at least currency wise. We have tried to do some of that work, and it's not straightforward to find comprehensive.
If you have something more data on this, how to find it, let me know. Okay, because
sure.
yes,
I think we might have something, but I'll write to you.
Okay, sure.
Okay. Do we have more questions? No? Okay. So thanks everyone for joining. Thank Juan Pablo, thank Gabriel. I think that this was very useful for us. I hope for you too. And stay in touch.
Thanks.
Thank you, Gustavo.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Javier.
Ciao.
Bye.
Ciao, ciao.